It's Brian Preston, the money guy.
Okay, SCCA 9526 has a question. He says, my wife and I just got married, and she has a much lower risk tolerance than I do. What's the best way to encourage her and us collectively to invest during a downturn? Because we know the market has kind of been, all over the place recently. What would you guys say to her?
Yeah, so this is interesting. I'm going to give you two answers. I'm going to give you like the academic financial answer, and then I'm going to give you the spouse answer, because sometimes those two don't always align. When it comes to risk and figuring out risk and solving for risk, and one of the ways that you can account for risk is really through education. The more that you understand something, the more comfortable you can become with that risk. We're watching this show on Netflix right now called Wild Croc Territory. I don't know if you've seen it. It's wild. It's so good. This guy is so comfortable around crocodiles. If you've not seen it, you're going to start watching it, and I bet our chat's about to blow up because it's so good. It's wild how comfortable this guy is around crocodiles because he understands it. It's something that's in his wheelhouse. It's something he's familiar with because he's educated on that. So I would encourage you, if you have a spouse who's really nervous about where the markets are right now and nervous about investing and nervous about that, it's a matter of educating that person, educating your spouse about how markets work and what business cycles look like and what happens during a bear market and what a bull market looks like, and try to have conversation where the education level lifts up. Now, here's where I'm going to be a little full disclosure here, Brian. My wife does not always love it when I try to teach her something, right? When I start doing that to her. So we have to focus on are the goals. We focus on what are the things that we want to do and what are the whys. And then we back into how do we accomplish that. So we want to be financially independent. We want to have our kids go to college. And we want to be able to do this and that and fill in the blank. Well, the means and mechanism through which we're able to do that is going to be through saving, deferred gratification, and taking that savings and investing. So those are the two things that I would throw out there.
So in this, because Bo made this thing sound like it was the most romantic discussion that you can have with your spouse, where you're talking about all these things. Here's what I would do if I was in these shoes, is that I think in the short term, there is risk in the fact that you want to have your cash and your cash isn't going to go anywhere in the short term. Your investments seem really scary because they can lose 15, 20, 25%. That's a short-term thing, so you're balancing what do I need, and that's why the financial order of operations does have cash and liquidity in the first step 1 and step 4, to make sure you're in a good place there. But you also have to think about that's short-term money. What about long-term money? Because when you're talking about goals like retirement, it's interesting to me is that when you back out your view from the short term to the long term and you look at it like a 10-year and beyond, all of a sudden that cash starts looking really cruddy. Yes, it's safe, but it didn't turn into anything. So it's actually risky because inflation, purchasing power, what it's going to do for you in retirement gets to be a very small, and you're like, oh man, that's a lost opportunity. Whereas when you look at that, what was perceived in the short term as scary money, when you scope out to the long-term view and look at it from 10 years and beyond, you're like, holy cow. So that thing that, yes, could in 1 year or a short term lose 10, 15, 20%, when I look at it on a 10-year basis, man, it really does hug that average line of 9 to 11%, pretty close. So if you can think about it in those visions, what's the time frame of these goals? Obviously, retirement for somebody who's just freshly married, I don't know. I'm assuming you're in your 20s or 30s. I'm just making an assumption that that means your money is not going to be, we're talking about gold, it's 20, 30 years in the future. So with that aspect, what feels safe is actually risky long-term because the purchasing power is going to be completely decimated over the long term. I grew up in a household where my parents only invested in cash and CDs, so I know what that journey looks like. Meanwhile, if you scope out what is in the short term feels risky is actually the safe thing to do long-term to ensure that your purchasing power, your retirement, and your goals are fulfilled. That's how I would have the discussion, is that you've got two different goals here. You've got short-term goals. That's what your cash reserves is going to be doing for you, steps 1 and 4 of the financial order of operations. Long term, you want to have investments so that your money can work harder than you can with your back, your brains, and your hands. And that's what your army of dollar bills are doing. And that's what steps 5, 6, 7, and beyond is trying to do for you when we're talking about the financial order of operations.
And it's interesting, Brian, because you said something. We were talking earlier about how you and your wife were talking, and she was nervous about not having an account in her name. And so you guys said, hey, okay, let's do this account in your name. Even though it wasn't necessarily the most optimal financial decision, it probably would have been more optimal to just use a card that you already had or have it in joint name. It was the right decision for the relationship. And I think sometimes when it comes to financial matters, that's okay. So when you're talking about, well, how do I get my wife to increase her risk tolerance? The question that may be better to answer is, how do I get my wife and I be on the same page around what we're both willing to accept? Maybe I have to come down a touch and she has to go up a touch, focusing on some of those short and long-term things.
I always think, and I know we need to wrap up this question, but it's a cash triage question too. And the fact that I will ask couples when I'm dealing, because it's not uncommon, we get calls, especially in volatile markets like this, where people will say, I just need comfort. I just need to feel good. So this is a perfect time to ask the question, is there a certain threshold of money in the bank that gives peace of mind? And if y'all talk about it, because you'll go figure out what your cash reserves number is, but maybe your spouse would like to have 20% more than that. Look, there's nothing wrong that you build that into your plan. You get to that 20% higher, but then once you cross that threshold, since y'all had a very good discussion about it, very open conversation, beyond that, then hopefully the spouse feels very comfortable with, now let's focus on the long term and taking that necessary risk to really maximize this money.
Love it.